Hello, my name is Thomas Felix Creighton. Welcome to British Culture, Albion Never Dies. Today, I'm looking at the Britishness of the Living Daylights, the 15th James Bond film. This podcast is dedicated to the gallant people of Afghanistan, just like 1988's Rambo 3. It has sometimes been claimed that Rambo 3 was originally dedicated to the brave Mujahideen fighters of Afghanistan, but this appears to be a hoax. Nonetheless, it is an interesting one. Rambo was portrayed fighting alongside the Mujahideen, just as James Bond in Timothy Dalton's first outing as James Bond 007. 1987's The Living Daylights delves into the then contemporary conflict in Afghanistan, which gives us the final third of the film. It was contemporary, then it was out of date, then contemporary again, then out of date again. What comes around, goes around. But Britain's history in Afghanistan goes back much further than this. In the 19th century, generations of Creightons, my family, fought in the northwest frontier of what is now Pakistan and into what is now modern Afghanistan. We have the medals and they all lived to claim them, and the pensions, a real rarity. They went up the Khyber Pass, which is mentioned a few times in the Living Daylights, so I'll be talking about what makes Afghanistan and the Khyber Pass so important and so resonant in British culture. So, in this podcast, as ever, with the Britishness of a Bond film, I'm not talking about this scene by scene, I'm talking about places, references and contexts that make this film particularly British. After all, everywhere I go in the world, James Bond is held up as a very good example of a British gentleman, and yet he's a man who does not drink tea, he doesn't wear bowler hats, he doesn't lean into the stereotypes of Britishness, but nonetheless seems to be very, very identifiable to people all around the world as an example of Britishness. So, this podcast, Afghanistan first, then a little potpourri of British aspects of the movie, and then Ian Fleming influences right at the end. Normally they're at the beginning, here they're right at the end. So, part 1, Brits in Afghanistan. I've mentioned before, in a 15-minute episode released on November the 1st, 2022, The Man Who Would Be King. It's one of my favourite short stories, written, published in 1888 by Rudyard Kipling, and as a movie in 1975 with Sean Connery and Michael Caine. One of the best adaptations, I'd say, of a short story. It expands upon it, gives it context. There's lots of rather oblique now references in the original 1888 short story, which the 1975 movie rarely gives some kind of context. A lot of it, if you love The Living Daylights, may look very familiar in terms of the movie, because the movie The Man Who Would Be King is also set in the same area, the Khyber Pass, going up into Afghanistan, but was also, like The Living Daylights, filmed in Morocco. In fact, specifically, Ait Ben Haddou, which appears in The Living Daylights, The Man Who Would Be King, Lawrence of Arabia, Gladiator, and many, many more. I believe it's UNESCO World Heritage Site. I also talked about some of this topic in my episode 165, The British Empire, my 5 favourite factual books, and I've got a YouTube episode on my favourite factual books for the British Empire. So, delving into this a little bit deeper, the Khyber Pass. There's an infamous painting, if you want some imagery, maybe worth a Google, The Remnants of an Army, Jellalabad, January the 13th, 1842. It is better known just as Remnants of an Army. Painted by Elizabeth Thompson, Lady Butler, in 1878. It shows Dr. William Brydon, the assistant surgeon in the Bengal Army, arriving at the gates of Jellalabad in January 1842. The landscape is desolate, largely barren. The man and the horse in the foreground are clearly exhausted, and in the background you can see some city walls and some friendly cavalry riding out to meet them. It looks, again, very much like the Afghanistan of the 3 movies I've mentioned. Why is this iconic? An army of 16,000 people had gone up the Khyber Pass from British India to Afghanistan. They were stationed in Afghanistan as part of the first Afghan war. That number includes British and Indian troops, wives, children, support, camp followers, cooks, servants, and a whole range of Indian merchants and their families. Pretty normal for the British East India Company at the time. Dr. Brydon rode back from the 16,000 number, and the guard at Jellalabad asked him, "Where is the army?" And he replied, "I am the army." The 30-year-old Scotsman was thought to be the only person who had survived that trip from Afghanistan down through the Khyber Pass, survived despite a sword wound to his head, which had taken part of his skull, as well as being shot in the leg and a sword gash to his hand. His horse had also been shot in the groin. The horse died shortly after reaching safety. The doctor would survive his injuries, and indeed survive 2 subsequent wars, and then enjoy a peaceful life and retirement, ultimately dying in 1873, aged 61. This is a disaster in the middle of the first Afghan war, which is what prompted the final assault on Kabul and ultimate British victory in the first Afghan war. It would be long remembered. Now, I described the army as British. I mentioned it was a British East India Company army, the Bengal Army. So, in terms of Britishness, well, there were Englishmen, Irishmen, very strongly represented actually Irishmen, Scotsmen and Welshmen. They were in red coats, they were defending British interests, but of course they weren't actually in the British Army. Why would they be? Just because they're British and Irish, and just because they're in red coats, and just because they're defending UK interests. They are, of course, in the British East India Company Army. A private corporation at this time was still consolidating its control of the subcontinent of India to facilitate trade. Now, it's often been compared to kind of an imagined idea. Imagine if Microsoft, Apple or Amazon decide to take over a country, say Nigeria and its surrounding countries. Not a perfect analogy, but one that kind of roughly works. The East India Company was a private company. It was taking over a large, populous landmass, and at its time, the East India Company was double the size of the British Army. In fact, it would be at several points throughout history. So to continue with the analogy, can you imagine if Jeff Bezos' Amazon decided to have an army twice the size of the American army, and just as well equipped, at times more so? If you can easily imagine this, it just goes to show the more things change, the more they stay the same. So I feel, from what I've said so far, there's 2 obvious questions. First of all, how on earth did we end up in this situation, a private company controlling a subcontinent? And then secondly, I keep referring to this as the first Afghan war. Obviously, there will be some more, but how many Afghan wars has Britain fought? I'll deal with the 2 questions in turn. First, how did we end up here? The short answer is outsourcing. The history of Britain from, say, Queen Elizabeth I in the 16th century to Queen Victoria in the 19th century is a story of England going from absolute peril to absolute preeminence. Queen Elizabeth I inherited a very weakened state after our religious reformation and internal struggles so great. The very survival of England as an independent state seemed very, very much in doubt. For a quick look at Britain at this time, I would actually recommend the movie Elizabeth starring Cate Blanchett. There's a minor actor in the film called Daniel Craig who plays a half-monk, half-hitman, something that would be directly referenced when Daniel Craig played James Bond in Casino Royale. I would quickly add, disregard the Elizabeth the Golden Age sequel, it really isn't worth it, but it shows Britain on the edge. It's a very, very good film, and whilst not entirely accurate, it's much more accurate than the average biopic of Queen Elizabeth I. One thing she had to do was outsource her foreign policy. Of course, if something was important and very, very close, it was under her control, but if it was going further afield, well, the English state simply didn't have the capacity. Famously, in the case of navies, she effectively licensed piracy for the duration of her various wars with Spain, creating something called privateers. Privateers became, well, kind of like pirates, and Sir Francis Drake is probably the most famous for his impact on history. There's a wonderful book called All the Countries We've Ever Invaded, which I think I've recommended a few times before, but it's startling how many pages you can find him on. And, of course, Henry Morgan, who's referenced throughout the novel Live and Let Die. Ian Fleming was particularly interested in Bloody Morgan. These aren't exactly carefree individuals fighting against the system. These people had access to substantial amounts of capital in England, enough to put together a flotilla of warship and take them on at least year-long expeditions. But they're not exactly at the top either, otherwise why would they take such a deadly risk? They have to put out a huge outlay, even without the Spanish. It was a dangerous business sailing all around the world at this time, or indeed even today. It's not within reach of the ordinary person, although many, many interesting people did join this. The most famous privateer was probably William Kidd. His story has become popular and less popular over time because he's a privateer who exceeded his brief. This kind of piracy has a license, but that license depends on, are we still at war with Spain? Are you attacking the right kind of ships? Are you doing the right kind of thing? William Kidd started out with all the good intentions of furthering British power and making himself rich by doing so, but he just struggled to find targets out on the high seas and ended up effectively just attacking the first foreign ship he found. Lo, behold, it belonged to an ally, an Arab ally of the East India Company. Here you end up with a conflict between two wealthy English interests, William Kidd as a privateer and the East India Company. A well-connected English gentleman, he demanded that he was given trial by Parliament, but was found guilty of murder and piracy, perhaps purely on the merits of the case, but having some of the richest and most influential men in England in the East India Company probably didn't help. There's a great deal of risk in this government outsourcing of power projection. I'm referencing various TV shows and movies and TV movies as I go throughout, because I think it can be just a fun intro into learning some of this. The East India Company was portrayed in the Sharp TV shows. The Sharp shows had Sean Bean as the man who could never die, quite against his current stereotype. He was, an absolute TV star. And the initial books are really about the East India Company. These ended up being the last few shows in which Sean Bean goes up against Maggie Smith's son, Toby Stephens. Toby Stephens played a villainous, renegade East India Company officer. Toby Stephens, of course, was the villain in 2002's Die Another Day and plays James Bond in the BBC Radio 4 adaptations of the Ian Fleming novels. He was particularly good in the adaptation of Live and Let Die, all about Henry Morgan's treasure. A very strong and apt adaptation. I feel like I haven't done quite enough groundwork of what are these corporations. As I say, I've talked about books I really admire on the British Empire, like Lawrence James, The Rise and Fall of the British Empire, or Niall Ferguson's Empire, How Britain Made the Modern World. I thought I'd do a different one just for the sake of variety. This is Empire, What Ruling the World Did to the British by Jeremy Paxman, a well-known journalist here in the UK. Reading from, hardback, page 56. Chartered companies were not unique to Britain. There were French, Dutch, Danish, Russian, Portuguese, German, and Swedish equivalents. Nor was Britain the first country to develop them. That distinction is claimed by a Swedish mining company. But they indisputably laid many of the foundations of the British Empire, and in some places did much more. The first phase of Britain's foreign empire was driven by capitalism, spread by sea and largely confined to those places which could be controlled from the sea. There were advantages for governments in leaving so much of the initiative with private enterprise. Chartered companies offered the Crown influence without the necessity of affluence. When Queen Elizabeth I sold exclusive rights to trade with the Great Turk to a group of businessmen, she received an assured payment every year. Since the contract also required the Turkey merchants to promote British interests, she gained a rudimentary diplomatic service on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean as well. The charter of the Muscovy Company committed it to trade in the regions, dominions, islands, and places unknown, and in trying to find a route to Cathay in the northeast passage above the landmass of Europe, the crew of one of its first fleets, made up of 3 little vessels, froze to death off Lapland. The fur trappers and traders of the Hudson's Bay Company became the largest landowners in the world. The Virginia Company owned much of the Atlantic coast of North America, and, since making a return on investment required the cultivation of cash crops, became licensed to plant settlements there. On the other side of the ocean, the Royal African Company cultivated almost nothing, but enjoyed a monopoly on the West African slave trade for a period, and for 50 years supplied the Royal Mint with gold, thereby coining the guinea. They were not called merchant venturers for nothing. Anyone who placed their faith in these companies took a risk that they might never see their money again. The distances were so vast and communications so slow that they might have to wait a year or more before they knew whether they had made any profit at all. But a risk divided is risk reduced, and the companies minimised the danger to investors by selling shares in their ventures and then offering the security of limited liability. In their internal organisation, the companies developed a single-minded focus on profit, the effective chain of command and the incentivisation of employees that are marks of efficient capitalism. The most famous chartered company of all, the East India Company, ended up translating a British trading and diplomatic presence into an overseas government. But it was clear from the start that what motivated the grandest society of merchants in the universe, according to itself, it never really did modesty, was money, rather than conquest. If it was necessary to fight, it would do so. But colonies were merely a means to an end. The company was obliged to raise an army to defend its interests, and created dockyards in order to build ships. But its soldiers' job was to secure trade, and the ship's purpose was to carry cargo home to Britain. And for those with the nerve to seize opportunity, the rewards could be lavish. Robert Clive arrived in India in 1744 as a clerk. He returned from Bengal to England 9 years later, with the means to buy a country estate. A further 5-year stint in India turned him into one of the richest men in Britain. The influx of such East India Company nabobs who had amassed astronomical fortunes by trade, pillage and intimidation set off a characteristic English bout of class anxiety. What is England now, worried Horace Walpole, a sink of Indian wealth, filled by nabobs, a country overrun by horse races, a gambling, robbing, wrangling, railing nation without principle, genius, character, or allies. Well, such was the domestic opinion on the British East India Company, and ultimately it would lose its monopoly on India. India would ultimately pass to the British Crown in the mid-19th century, and the East India Company dissolved more towards the end of the century. But this is the origin of the wars in Afghanistan, between Britain and Afghanistan. How many were there? 3 official wars with Britain and Afghanistan, excluding campaigns of which there were many. In fact, the first independent RAF operation, unsupported by the Royal Navy or the British Army, was in Afghanistan, Pink's War, named after an RAF officer, Mr. Pink. And Winston Churchill fought as a young man in an Afghan campaign and wrote back stating that people back home would not believe nor understand the brutality of war in the mountains. Again, if we're looking for media, The Drum, a 1938 film, is worth seeing, perhaps unremarkable in its qualities as a piece of drama, but it's absolutely remarkable for some of the footage. The British authorities cooperated with the filmmakers, so the shots of British troops marching through the mountains is real. They made it look like an army was marching through the mountains by marching an army through the mountains. So that's The Drum, 1938. In some parts of the world, you can just watch that on YouTube. Again, how many wars were there? First Anglo-Afghan War, 1838 to 1842. Second Anglo-Afghan War, 1878 to 1880. Third Afghan War, 1919. But there's also, in between these and continuing after, the Hazara expedition, numerous Waziristan campaigns, the Tira campaign, operations against the Momads, Bunawals and Swatis, operations against the Masuds, and so on, and so on, and so on. There's been no shortage of Anglo-Afghan wars, campaigns, and so on. I feel that closes the chapter, Part 1, Brits in Afghanistan. Now for Part 2, a potpourri of Britishness. Back to the movie. The Living Daylights is the first James Bond movie to star Timothy Dalton, somebody who the filmmakers had long courted, long wanted to have. Of course, he was the original choice for On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Allegedly, he rejected at the time, feeling that he was too young because he was a fan of the books. He absolutely loved the books. He read and reread them, and it influenced a lot of his decisions and choices as an actor. That's been very well covered, and I would recommend A.J. Chowdhury and Matthew Field's Some Kind of Hero, some good sections on that. I'd recommend John Glenn's book, For My Eyes Only. And of course the podcast episode when I interviewed John Glenn. He's a serious Shakespearean actor, somebody who is quite different in his screen presence from actually any of the previous Bonds, and he's often described as the connoisseur's Bond. If you enjoy the novels, if you enjoy the rich history of James Bond, then he's probably a Bond you gravitate to. As I say, this section is just a potpourri of different things that caught my eye. He, at one point, brings along a Harrods hamper for a particular guest of MI6. Harrods is a Grade 2 listed luxury department on Brompton Road in Knightsbridge in London. Grade 2 meaning the building is protected. You can't change it substantially. You can amend minor aspects. It's not Grade 1, but you still have to apply for planning permission to make any significant changes to the exterior. It opened in 1905. It replaced the first store on the grounds, founded in 1849, which burned down in 1881. The store spans over 1 million square feet, which makes it one of the largest department stores in Europe, one of the largest in the world, and as of 2023 it attracted 15 million visitors. Certainly I've been around at Christmas just to have a look at all the fancy displays. It is also notable that in the past it has had a customer dress code introduced in 1989. As of, I think, 2023, they state that they don't have a specific dress code now for entry into the store, including any of the restaurants, but they do reserve the right to refuse entry to anyone who's not deemed to be appropriately dressed. Sportswear, including trainers, shorts and tracksuits, are permitted across all areas of the store and restaurants. The Independent newspaper covered the Harrods dress code in an article on Sunday the 17th of July 1994 by Louise Levine, which I found quite amusing to read. She wrote, "Don't come as you are. There is only Harrods dress code." It has been 5 years now since Harrods introduced its dress code, but people are still getting terribly upset about it. Mortified Londoners just cannot get over being refused entry to a mere shop. Instead of taking their custom elsewhere or simply putting some trousers on, they write aggrieved letters to the newspapers, which still print them. For those of you who have been doing all your shopping elsewhere, the Harrods dress code can be summarised as follows: no beachwear, no backpacks, no riffraff. Under the Al Fayyeds, the owners of Harrods, Harrods has become a victim of its own success. Sumptuous displays and some striking refurbishment meant that everyone wanted to have a good look round. That was often all they wanted. Bona fide customers could not see the merchandise for half-dressed tourists with telephoto lenses snapping the wet fish. Banning photography and selling more postcards was an obvious move, but how was the management to keep out the rest of the coach party element? As the voice of the chairman's office put it, "Quite frankly, our lady customers didn't appreciate queuing up for their bagel or baguette next to someone in crotch-high shorts and a vest showing their hairy armpits. The dress code was the logical step." The core of the local clientele was thrilled. Around 60% of Harrods customers live within 3 miles of the shop in the so-called Tiara Triangle. Dowagers no longer walked in fear of encountering the revolting spectacle of an unwashed Swede at the vegetable counter. Fading pop stars predictably used the code as a mechanism for getting their pictures in the paper. One of these, described by the Harrods spokesperson as "this goss person," went along in some fetchingly torn trousers to be turned away, ensuring tabloid coverage gleefully pounced on the fact that Harrods had ejected a badly dressed person who had lots of money. The wonderful thing about the dress code is that Harrods does not care if you have lots of money. You are not allowed in dressed like that. The press dutifully took up cudgels on behalf of the underdressed, conveniently overlooking the fact that London pubs had been refusing refreshment to any working man in soiled clothing for years. And have you ever tried buying a McDonald's with no shirt on? Harrods insists that higher standards enhance the pleasure of shopping there, but there are other considerations. The odd half-naked megastar may slip through the net, but your average topless backpacker in cut-off jeans is unlikely to be the last of the big spenders. Harrods is not a democracy. It is not a public service. Nobody has the right to be there. It is a shop. It is private property, and it only lets people inside if it thinks it will profit from the exchange. Well, this podcast is all about Britishness and how British can you get. Louise Levine writing in the Independent newspaper way back in 1994. Don't come as you are. Although, possibly now you can. James Bond was taking his Harrods hamper along to a country house, the Blaydon safe house in the movie, from which Koskov, well, I won't go into it, I don't have any real spoilers. In reality, it's Stoner House in Henley-upon-Thames in Oxfordshire. Country houses are pretty stereotypically English, but as I said earlier, Bond isn't stereotypically English. He doesn't drink tea. He doesn't ever have high tea, either in Fleming's novels or in the Eon Productions movies. He doesn't wander around in a bowler hat with an umbrella. So it's not something we often see in a Bond film. I mean, there is Shrublands in Thunderball briefly, but occasionally a real country house in the UK doubles for something somewhere else. But here we have it all. Harrods hamper, horse riding, tweeds, log fire, servants. It actually looks really like something from Upstairs Downstairs or Downton Abbey or whatever your preferred England for export or England for tea time telly drama happens to be. Of course, Downton Abbey has Samantha Bond, who plays Miss Moneypenny in the Pierce Brosnan Bond films. I say kind of England for export. This is a term sometimes given it to this kind of drama by cultural historians in the UK, often who don't like this kind of thing and feel it's a kind of fictitious version of England that rarely is being sold to America and the Far East. It's a common criticism in academia, but interesting that we only rarely have it in the Bond films here in terms of fulfilling all those stereotypes. Also, as a country house, there's a scene with the Russian General Pushkin, played by John Rhys-Davies, better known to many of us as Gimli the Dwarf in Lord of the Rings. General Pushkin is at a conference where Bond has a spotlight shone on him, and he shoots it out, giving us it looks like the gun barrel sequence. It's supposed to be in Tangiers in Morocco, but it is in fact Elveden Hall, which is also in Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut, and it's the interior of the villain's mansion in Lara Croft Tomb Raider. This is a private home, it's not open to the public, so occasionally used for films. It's a British stately home with Indian inspiration, which is why it can often be used as the supposed interior of something far overseas. The idea of a British stately home with Indian inspiration is not unique. I've talked a great deal about the British East India Company, and of course India became part of the British Empire. Brighton Pavilion is probably the most famous thing that you can go and see, kind of quite a curious design and not exactly Indian, but that's where the inspiration came from, whilst Queen Victoria's residence in the Isle of Wight, Osborne House, has the Durbar rooms, which can be visited. Again, it's an English country house with an Indian interior, and it doesn't have to be such grand places. There's also a few examples around Bradford of 19th century gardens in Lister Park, a short distance from where I'm recording, which is set out in Mughal style, an Indian-inspired garden. So you can find these things out and about. I'm going to stray now into an area which is not necessarily my personal comfort zone, which is cars. James Bond drives a contemporary Aston Martin. In fact, it's the last kind of contemporary Aston Martin that we'll have in the 20th century Bond films. Of course, he will use the archaic one in a few others. Anyway, at the start of this film, we see our hero, played for the first time by Timothy Dalton, driving a V8 Volante. And taking this from the Aston Martin's blog, they even have the number plate, B549WUU. There will be no quiz at the end. Anyway, it's Cumberland grey with coachwork and upholstered in black leather. The car was, in fact, the personal transport of Victor Gauntlet, the chairman of Aston Martin. This car, even without visiting Q Branch, was a bit special, as it claimed that it came with a Vantage engine, which might have been a bit of a fib, again according to the Aston Martin blogs. Now, the writer says, I eventually saw this particular V8 at the AMOH Horsefall race meeting in 2007, participating in the 007 track parade during the film. Whilst in Volante form, the V8 did not display any particular special features. A little later, again we see the Volante, this time in Q's workshop, where it appears to be receiving a hard top. The script describes the car as being winterized. The result is a V8 Saloon, an Oscar India car that you're expected to believe is the Volante with a closed roof, but it is of course impossible. Hey, it's only a film. In reality, the factory used a pair of second-hand V8s which were refurbished and modified for filming the stunt work in the mountains of Austria. Again, much of the plot was set in Czechoslovakia. They do have visible Vantage badges, but these, I guess, were fitted as they would have been seen on the Volante. To all intents and purposes, the car was an Oscar India V8, not a Vantage, as is often said. Again, purely drawing from the AstonMartins.com blog, and it's all about 007 V8 from the Living Daylights. I couldn't find the author's name. If you have any disagreement over whether it is an Oscar India or whether it is a Vantage, please don't bother me. Take it to the website I'm taking from. This is really not my subject. More on my subject, I just find the Living Daylights quite different in its depiction of British tech, and yes, I guess Aston Martin is part of that. For example, it's highlighting, and interestingly, the only really good example in the Bond films of the Harrier jump jet. I always think of The Simpsons, Season 7, Episode 9, Sideshow Bob's Last Gleaming, when I see the Harrier jump jet. An Air Force officer says, "Get ready for the pride of the United States Air Force, the British-made Harrier jump jet." Later on in the episode, there's a guide who says, although it looks complicated, it is so well designed, even a child could fly it. The daughter, Lisa Simpson, says, "Can I fly it?" And the guide says, "Of course you cannot." So this was the British Harrier jump jet. There's reference, Q makes reference to, we're making this for the Americans. There seems to be a certain pride in this film in British technology, and you could say that about all of the Bond films, but there have been some really good deeper readings from the Institute of James Bond Studies, a real thing, by the way. It's not a permanent institute, it's a series of academics who all have permanent other jobs, but occasionally they'll write articles on Bond from their different perspectives. The Institute of James Bond Studies has a website, and you can download PDFs of various studies they have. And one of them is on patriotism and nationalism, noting how it swings from kind of ironic to sincere. So a sincere example would be much of Skyfall. I'd suggest The Living Daylights is a relatively sincere kind of patriotism, to the ironic, oh, the things I do for England. So I find that really interesting, the Institute of James Bond Studies, and I'd suggest that this one is a good example of genuine patriotism. But on the topic of the Harrier jump jet, I was looking around for interesting articles, and to be honest, the most interesting one I found was an all-American story. Leonard versus PepsiCo, a court case. In the mid-1990s, Pepsi faced stronger and stronger competition from Coca-Cola and sought to attract a younger audience. So in March of that year, 1996, Pepsi began a promotional campaign called Pepsi Stuff, allowing customers to accrue Pepsi points that in turn could be redeemed for items such as t-shirts, leather jackets, and these points could be earned through purchasing any Pepsi product with labels attached to the boxes of these products. The campaign was the largest in Pepsi's history, and to advertise the promotion, Pepsi released a series of TV adverts. One of these adverts showcased a computer-generated Pepsi-branded Harrier jump jet. The commercial, which offered the jet for 7 million Pepsi points, caught the attention of John Leonard, a 21-year-old business student. In place of a label, the promotion allowed Pepsi points to be directly purchased for 10 cents per point, a detail noted by Leonard, who convinced 5 investors to lend him a total of $700,000. So, Leonard sent a check for $700,000 and $8.50, because that includes the money for shipping and handling, and 15 labels per promotion rules. The offer was refused by Pepsi, who referred to the promotion of the Harrier jump jet in the commercial as fanciful. and stated its intention was to create a humorous and entertaining ad. Well, it's America. Leonard sued. He took them to court, but, I mean, you can read up on this case yourself, Leonard versus PepsiCo, but I'll give the answer. He did not get the check. So, to close, Fleming. Ian Fleming. Often, things that appear in Bond films have a bit of history and heritage back to Ian Fleming. So my first question was, are the locations Fleming-y? And one of the key locations, apart from Afghanistan, is Gibraltar and Tangier. So, I've been poring over. My usual favourite is Nicholas Shakespeare's Ian Fleming's Complete Man, but for this one, I felt there's slightly better chapters from John Pearson, The Life of Ian Fleming. The first reading I'll take from John Pearson's biography of Ian Fleming is from the chapter Fleming's War. 1941 was a key year in the naval career of Commander Ian Fleming. It was then that he came nearest to living that life of high adventure he had always dreamed of. After a year like this, nothing would ever be quite the same again. It began in February with a short trip to Tangier to check on naval intelligence in North Africa. This was the sort of adventure he loved. He was on his own at last on a secret mission across the neutral no-man's land of wartime Europe. The London winter was behind him. So was the clatter and the tension of room 39. He carried the commando fighting knife and the fountain pen with cyanide cartridge, but he travelled as a civilian, wearing a dark blue suit, an old Etonian tie, and carrying an official diplomatic courier's passport. It was a splendid, archaic-looking document, and he made the exciting wartime journey by plane to Lisbon, then across to Madrid, down to Gibraltar, and over the narrow strait to the international city of Tangier before returning to Madrid. He must have felt that he was stepping into the pages of a thrilling novel at last. It was not a hazardous mission, but Fleming was not the man to become mousy about it at all. I'll leave it there. This, for me, is interesting because we have not only Tangier, which is in the living daylights, as Fleming's first exciting foreign mission, one that would take him into the world of James Bond, dark blue suits, pens with cyanide capsules and so on, but it also would take him to Gibraltar, which of course provides us with a pre-title sequence of The Living Daylights. Would he ever go there again? Actually, at a second important point in his life, a second key juncture. The Life of Ian Fleming, chapter Golf and Gold. The most startling and exciting assignment of my career has just swung into my ken, and means that I have to fly off to Tangier immediately, and there to settle down for 2 or 3 weeks in a hotel with a famous spy. Male, alas. The results of this union are going to be most startling, but the whole project is so hush, I cannot tell you more about it. As usual, Fleming loved to mystify his friends, but the excitement was genuine. Ever since Diamonds Are Forever, he had been keeping an interested eye on one particular affliction of the international diamond market. He thought that the whole story of the battle against diamond smuggling and illicit diamond buying might have formed a plot for one of his own books, but he saw no chance of writing it because the necessary basis of fact would never be revealed to him or anyone else. He had, however, reckoned without Sir Percy Sillitoe, formerly of MI5, and now winding up his private organisation known as IDSO, the International Diamond Security Organisation, which had been set up by the Diamond Corporation to investigate great leakages which had been threatening the stability of the world diamond market. Sillitoe, seldom averse to publicity, conceived the idea of having a book written about the success story of his small, secret organisation, and the closing days of IDSO, somewhat disgruntled that it was being disbanded, he commissioned one of its senior members, an English solicitor named John Collard, later known as John Blaze, to put down the story before returning to his legal desk. The solicitor duly wrote a sober and balanced narrative which Sillitoe took to his friend Dennis Hamilton of the Sunday Times. Hamilton, who knew his Diamonds Are Forever, realised that it was a remarkable story, but one which would be all the better for a professional hand. Ian Fleming must meet Collard, who would have been astonished and derisive had he known Fleming had described him as a famous spy. At any rate, the two of them spent a week together in Tangier, and Fleming came back with sufficient material for the big series in the Sunday Times, carried that autumn under his name, The Diamond Smugglers. Of course, Fleming wrote The Diamond Smugglers. So here we have two key points in Fleming's life which take him to Tangier. One, his intelligence work, and two, his later work in journalism. And of course, Ian Fleming Publications have recently put out a collection of Ian Fleming's journalistic work, Speak of the Devil. So, where it all begins with Fleming's own life. Of course, we have the short story, The Living Daylights, which gives us at least one scene in the film, but of course has to be expanded out from that. It gives us a bit of jazz. Ian Fleming loved jazz music, as anyone who's read Live and Let Die would know. I'll leave out Central Europe, again, the kind of the middle chunk of the film, because, well, that's very Fleming-y, and I feel he covers it more and better in another book, and it's gone into in another film, in fact quite a few of the other films. So I'll leave this for the episode most likely on Her Majesty's Secret Service. There's a new book on His Majesty's Secret Service, but I do have an episode in the works on Her Majesty's Secret Service, one requested by a good friend of mine, and I've been working away at this for some time. So there are more James Bond episodes coming. If you'd like a bit more on Gibraltar, again, that's the pre-title of The Living Daylights. My old episodes 133 and 134 were all about Gibraltar, thanks to my friend Kane, who purely to help my podcast actually flew out to Gibraltar and spent a whole weekend there just doing research for me. Thank you very much to Kane for doing that and for giving me the time to interview you. And of course, The Living Daylights was directed by John Glenn, who I interviewed in episode 189. That is the Britishness of The Living Daylights. I got very into my research, especially of the British in Afghanistan, and I've had to leave out a certain amount of my research just to pack this into less than 45 minutes. So if there's anything that you're interested in, do get in touch. On Instagram, I'm at Fleming Never Dies, but you can just email me, albionneverdies@gmail.com. And of course, I have my website, albionneverdies.com, especially where I'm putting all the episodes related to James Bond and filling in those gaps now, the films that I haven't done for one reason or another. So if there's something you want me to cover, James Bondy, again, just get in touch. I do requests. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed this, and that next time you watch The Living Daylights, you enjoy all the odd little British moments. Goodbye.